Well, according to a recent Barna study, the share of practicing Christians has nearly dropped in half since 2000. And for the first time ever, according to Gallup, less than half of Americans say they are members of a church or any house of worship. That's down from 70% in 1999. So the number of church goers in this country is shrinking, raising really critical concerns that we need to address and that we're going to actually consider tonight. So it's in this environment that Gone for Good, and you've had a chance to really get to know this book, and I encourage you to, you're going to hear from some contributors, and we have a book table. It's this book that really explores ways that churches are transitioning and transforming their church properties to serve their neighborhoods. And tonight we're going to hear from Mark Elsdon, who's the editor of this book, and three contributors. And I did mention the book table. Jean is over there. We have books for a suggested donation, both Gone for Good, which is the book we're focusing on tonight, Mark's previous book entitled We Aren't Broke, Uncovering Hidden Resources for Mission and Ministry, as well as a table set up with Rooted Good materials that will talk a lot and will help you think through church property transition. So, and a lot of other things as well. So I invite you to take a look at the Rooted Good table as well, and Mark can help with that after the program. I have the utmost respect for Mark. He's just been a real pillar on this campus, the campus ministry setting. He's assembled an amazing group of contributors, and they have really gotten to know each other as friends. So I think that's really great. He might say a little bit more about how they met. I'm also delighted that Erica Liu is here as well. Erica co-leads Pres House, and I know your fingertips are all over this book as well. And Mark and Erica together lead that ministry. And then I think Sophie's here, their youngest daughter. And then I think Emma is potentially dialed in from Fordham University. So we're just super excited to welcome the whole family tonight. Well, it's my privilege now to introduce my colleague, Jean Guerin, who will give us a little bit of the lay of the land for tonight, and we'll introduce Mark.
Thanks, John. It's really wonderful to see everybody here. I am going to just give you a little bit of Mark's bio, but before I do, I wanted to just give you a plan for the evening. After I introduce him, Mark is going to introduce the book to us all, give us some broad brushstrokes that way, and then he's going to be in charge of introducing our three other panelists. Each of them will have about 10 minutes for their presentations on their chapters and maybe other parts of the book. And after they're done, I'll come back up with Mark and Kurt and the panelists, and we'll have a question and answer period. So we're hoping to target that at about 7. We'll regroup for the Q&A. John's going to be helping to take your questions out there. And then for the folks online, please be sending your questions through the chat function, and I will be monitoring those and presenting those to the panelists as well. So it is a real honor and privilege to introduce Mark Elsdon to you. He's the executive director of Pres House and Pres House Apartments. He's co-founder of Rooted Good, which supports church leaders working on property development, money and mission alignment, and social enterprise. He's author, as John said, of another book, We Aren't Broke, Uncovering Hidden Resources for Mission and Ministry. He's got a BA in psychology from UC Berkeley. He's got a master in divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and an MBA from UW's Business School here. He's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, USA, and he lives here in Madison with his family. So I'd like to invite you up, Mark, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Greetings to those watching online on the live stream. I'm honored, humbled that you took time to get here, especially in the icy roads that we have here in Madison, or have responded to my twisting your arm to show up. But either way, thanks. Thanks for being here. And a big thanks to everyone at Upper House for hosting. We're doing quite the technological dance here tonight. And so really grateful for you and your hospitality. As anyone who has put a book together knows, it is a labor of love and the work of a community of people. That's particularly true in the case of this book. And so before I go any further, I want to first thank some of the key people that helped us arrive at this day. First and foremost, I'm incredibly grateful for the contributors to this book who have shared their insights, their experience, and many, many gifts with me and the readers of the volume. In addition to the words that they share on the pages of the book, these authors are doing an incredible and important work around the country to bring about more good in the world. And in my view, the foreword that Dr. Willie James Jennings wrote for the book is actually worth the price of the book alone. I'm humbled, inspired, and grateful for their partnership on this project. I'm blessed to work for two organizations that are incredibly supportive of me as a person in this project, Press House here in Madison and Rooted Good, which was mentioned a moment ago. My board and staff team at Press House provide the support and flexibility to make a project like this possible. And I cannot overstate how vital my colleagues at Rooted Good have been in bringing this book about. I'm grateful to the team at Eerdmans Publishing for entertaining the idea for this book so soon after my first book, We Aren't Broke, was published, and of course for guiding me through all of the process and the pages along the way. And a special thanks to Cote Sorens, who not only wrote an excellent chapter, but also did the beautiful illustrations that are found throughout the book. If you haven't had a chance, just take a look at it over there on the table. And we're really lucky to hear from her tonight. Finally, I'm thankful for all the pastors, church leaders, and church buildings that have touched me and my family over the years. 20 years from now, some of them may be gone, but the mark that they have left will remain. And God has worked through you, and for that, I am grateful. And in the end, it is a joy to share my life with my spouse and co-pastor Erica Liu and my daughters Emma and Sophie. And I have to thank them for putting up with, yes, another book in our life. So what is this book about? And why the title, Gone for Good? The question that keeps me up at night is this. 20 years from now, when we look around our neighborhoods and we realize that a third or more of our church properties are no longer churches, what will we have lost or gained? And what will the impact be on the spiritual and social fabric of our communities? I wonder and worry about this in part because as I reach middle age and look back on my life, I realize that churches and their buildings have played a huge role in shaping who I am today. Not just in my spiritual life, but in my profession as a pastor, but in big ways and small, in the profound and the mundane. Anyone who knows me well knows that despite the fact that I am an ordained minister, I'm full of critique, skepticism, sometimes it tips over into cynicism about the church. But there is no denying that churches have made me who I am today and changed the trajectory of my life many times, even before I was born. It's likely that I got my surname from a tiny church in a tiny village in the rolling green hills of northern England near the Scottish border. The story goes like this. In the early 18th century, an orphan baby was left on the doorstep of St. Cuthbert's Church in the village of Elsdon. The vicar, the pastor, took the baby in and named him Cuthbert Elsdon after the 7th century saint who gave the church its namesake, and after the village. Thus started the Elsdon line. My family name was born out of grace in a moment of need on the steps of a church. My parents were born and raised in the Newcastle area of northeast England, not far from the village of Elsdon. When they immigrated to the United States for my father's work, they knew nobody. So one of the first places they went to was church. One Sunday morning, after attending for a few months, they decided to invite some of their newfound acquaintances over to their home. Chatting amiably after worship service, probably in a space like this, they offered their invitation to a handful of couples. Would you like to come over next Saturday night to share a joint? Their invitation was met with silence, maybe some chuckles, awkward looks. My parents were confused by the lack of enthusiasm for this invitation. Is it us? Is it our accent? It took a little while to figure out where the misunderstanding lay, but eventually it dawned on them, oh, no, not that kind of a joint. A joint of roast beef and some Yorkshire pudding. Would you like to come over for dinner? Those friendships survived my parents' offer of drugs at church, and that congregation became a vital source of community and relationship for a young immigrant couple making a new life thousands of miles from home. So that church and others like it played pivotal roles in my life as I grew up. During middle school, I made my best friends at church and trekked mud from the creek nearby throughout the entire building more than once. During high school, I would regularly bring half of my cross-country running team to the gym of another church for a rigorous game of basketball while we were supposed to be out on long runs. A friend from yet another church invited me to go on a youth group trip to ride our 10-speed bikes in the mountains of Colorado for a week, sleeping in, yes, more churches every night. I left that week and the follow-up trips each summer with an increasing love for cycling and for God. I was taught about the faith and at least occasionally attended services at these churches, but church was more than that. It was a place to find friends, to play basketball, to get dirty, to be reprimanded kindly. Later, as I finished high school and went to college, churches played a more formative role in my life than even my university experience. In Berkeley, California, I became friends with people experiencing homelessness through a program my roommate and I started at a church. My privilege was illuminated and challenged, meeting people attending churches in rural Dominican Republic, mountains of Ethiopia, cities in France, and Black, Indigenous, and immigrant churches throughout the United States. And like so many, I owe my married life and amazing children to a church community because I met my future spouse, Erica, volunteering at a church meal for people experiencing food insecurity. While training as a pastor in seminary, Erica and I worked at a Taiwanese Presbyterian church, which afforded me the chance to see how churches play a special role in the social fabric of marginalized and immigrant communities. Presbyterian churches have supported the independence of Taiwan for many decades, engaging not just in the spiritual or eternal, but in the very present and pressing realities of living under occupation and threat. In the United States, immigrant churches serve as family, community center, language training, support group, Google search bar, and so much more. Today, I have the great privilege of serving at Press House, a campus ministry and housing community literally just across the street, right there across University Avenue. The ministry has been around for almost 120 years. During the campus protests of the 1960s that took place just steps from here on the University Library Mall, student activists and 20-year-old National Guard troops left their respective signs and guns on the steps outside of Press House. Young people from both sides of a conflict that they hadn't started but were players in would come inside for coffee and a safe respite from the unrest outside. I've spent countless nights sleeping on other church floors during service learning trips with college students all over the country, and churches from all around Madison support our ministry by providing the only home-cooked meal that many students eat each week. My life has been impacted by literally hundreds of churches. While I imagine this is more than the average American, churches and their buildings play a vital role in the social infrastructure of communities in every corner of the country. Even many who have never attended a worship service are often directly or indirectly touched by a church building. So what happens when churches are gone? As Eileen Lindner explains in the opening chapter of the book, as many as 100,000 church buildings and billions of dollars of church-owned property could be sold or repurposed throughout the United States by 2030. That amounts to a quarter or a third or even 40% of the churches out there. It's difficult to get precise data on exactly how many church properties will be sold because nobody's tracking it in any systematic way. As John mentioned at the beginning, researchers are making projections about the future of religious affiliation in the United States. You may have seen the news about a new model by the Pew Research Center that predicts if recent trends continue, Christians will make up fewer than half of the U.S. population by 2070, or maybe even less. There are, of course, new churches starting every year, but as of 2019, we have entered into an era where more churches close each year than are opened. Now, let me be clear. I do not believe that God is going away. God is not declining. Some churches will grow, new churches will be planted, not all churches will close. People still want to experience the transcendent, the divine. They still crave and thrive in caring community. They still want to be involved in causes and activities that are larger than themselves and that change lives for the better. But the reality is that fewer and fewer people want to experience those things in a Sunday morning worship service followed by Sunday school class, which means there are too many church buildings with too much space than will be viable or needed in the future. These buildings and properties will have to become something else, or they'll just sit empty and unused. Like the decline of the indoor shopping mall or the closure of blockbuster video rental stores when Netflix came onto the scene, churches are closing, and property owned by churches is changing at a speed and scale never seen before. The data and my experience working with church leaders around the country from across the denominational spectrum is very clear. We are facing a massive tsunami of church closure and property reuse rising up before us. The transition is happening. We are long past the days of revitalizing every church in order to keep them all open and operating buildings that are too large or needing a huge renovation. This transition is happening in every part of the country and across all denominational and theological lines. Again, to reiterate, I'm not saying that new churches won't be planted or that church revitalization can't happen. You'll hear a beautiful story from Reverend Joe Daniels in a few minutes about how developing affordable housing on church land helped his congregation grow. But, broadly speaking, throughout communities everywhere in the country, and most certainly here in Madison, church properties are going to become something different on a massive scale, whether we like it or not. The wave is upon us. And this transition in church property is a once-in-a-many-generation shift. As that property is sold or becomes something else, it won't go back to being a church again in any foreseeable future. So the question before us is this. After the wave of sale and repurpose crashes upon the shore, what will we be left with when the water flows back out to sea? What will our neighborhoods look like? After the wave has receded, will church property have further contributed to injustice and the widening gap between rich and poor? Or will we have put our creativity and energy into new uses that leave communities more connected, more just, and with new programs and support that bring light and life into people's lives? If 40 out of 100 churches in a city are something else in 20 years, what will be lost and what could be gained? Where will the local Girl Scout troop or neighborhood association meet? Where do people go when grieving yet another mass shooting? Millions of people meet lifelong friends and partners at churches, get access to financial services not available to them through traditional banking, or pick up food when bills are tight. And where will we vote? Churches are not just vital spiritual resources in a community, they provide vital social services that touch lives far beyond their parishioners. In his chapter, Robert Yeager writes about a series of studies that Partners for Sacred Places conducted looking at what they called a halo effect of churches in a community. They found almost 3.7 million people visited just 90 churches in 1 year. Only 9% of those visits were for worship. 91% was for something else. The study also found that on average, each church provided more than $4 million of economic value to its community each year. That's the number of value created as they are now, even in decline in aggregate. What will replace churches on those properties that become something else? I don't want to look back 20 years from now and regret the huge loss of spiritual and social fabric that churches provide, or have missed an opportunity to do new wonderful things with these properties. I don't want all the beautiful church spaces that were built for community life to be replaced by privately owned condo buildings making money for already wealthy people, or to just stand empty with a fence around them, while the stones crumble and community groups can't find anywhere to meet. There's a significant risk that wide-scale transition of church property will leave us with less support for the most vulnerable, greater inequality, fewer spiritual resources, and other losses. Church properties very well could end up gone for good, gone forever, leaving little social or spiritual good in their place. But that doesn't have to be the outcome. The situation is not all doom and gloom. This is also a moment of extraordinary opportunity. The Christian story is one of death and resurrection, of new life and a new future. As daunting and deeply sad as this wave of transition is, there's also an incredible opportunity to think about the mission of the church in a more expansive manner, to make greater use of church buildings and land to serve our neighborhoods, and to extend the light of God's grace in beautiful ways that are very, very good. I've had the blessing and privilege of being a part of a number of church property transitions that have led to new and good things emerging. Many of you know the story of Press House, where we developed the Press House Apartments student housing facility on a church-owned parking lot, financed by church investment funds. We house residents in a sober living recovery community, provide wellness and health support. We give out meals to students on campus who are food insecure, and serve as a home away from home for thousands of college students each year. We've given away about $1 million in scholarships to residents in the last decade. While weekly Sunday worship does remain central to our mission, we've gone much deeper and wider with our ministry, transforming areas of students' lives that previously were absent from. The adaptive reuse of our property transformed a dormant and worn campus ministry center that was almost sold into a vibrant, impactful, and financially sustainable ministry. And through my work at Rooted Good, I've watched churches around the country go through our Good Futures Accelerator course and come out on the other side with all kinds of incredible ideas for the use of their buildings and land that is extending their ministry into the community in new and powerful ways and generating new revenue. Congregations are serving young entrepreneurs by converting fellowship halls into co-working spaces, drawing people into community who would never attend a worship service. They're organizing co-op grocery stores to address food deserts in their neighborhoods in a sustainable way. They're opening childcare centers for teenage mothers. They're creating lawn care services, bike shops, music venues, and fair trade stores. Or they're building housing, sometimes for students, sometimes for seniors, sometimes for lower-income neighbors who've been priced out of the market. One recently closed church near Portland, Oregon, was just given to a coalition of Native American groups so that they can build tiny homes for Indigenous women and children experiencing homelessness. Repurposing church property is a chance to do something new. It allows us to think differently, to see more vividly, to listen more deeply, and love more fully. It's an opportunity to take the good news outside of the Sunday worship service. The transition of church property is one of the largest issues facing the church today, but it's also one of our greatest opportunities. Yes, churches, buildings, and property will be gone. Of this, there is no doubt. But more than that, I'm incredibly hopeful that new and good things will emerge, and they will be gone for good. So let me close my comments with a brief word about the book itself and how it came together with the 19 incredible contributors. I don't know about you, but I've always loved the children's tale about stone soup. You know that story? There's many different versions that approach it from different cultural perspectives, but in general, the outline usually goes like this. A group of travelers, 3 or 4, arrive in a village carrying only a cooking pot. They set the pot on a fire in the middle of the village and fill it with water. Then they drop in a stone. They begin cooking the stone soup. At first, the villagers sort of peer out the window and they're like wondering what the heck is going on, but then curiosity gets the better of them. They come out to see what's happening. and they look in the pot and they see there's just a stone in it. And they say, well, that's not going to taste very good. So then they run back inside and they start to grab ingredients. One by one, they add something. One brings some garlic, another some greens, another a carrot. Eventually, almost everyone in the village has brought an ingredient and the soup smells amazing. What started out as a stone in a pot has become this delectable soup through this collaborative contribution of the diversity of people. In many ways, this book is like a written version of Stone Soup. I have personally brought very little to the project besides the stone, the driving question. I dropped that stone into the pot and the authors have contributed their incredible ingredients. As you read the book, you will find that while all the authors care deeply about churches, only a few of them are theologians, pastors, or traditional church people. You will hear from property developers and urban planners, philanthropists, real estate professionals, and more. And this is intentional. I invited these people to contribute their unique ingredients to the soup that is this book because that's exactly how this work is going to have to happen in the real world too. A soup made up entirely of celery wouldn't be particularly tasty, but one that includes varied and complementary ingredients can be sublime. I'm so grateful to be joined today by 3 of the contributors to Gone for Good. I wish we could hear from all of them this evening, but you're going to want to go home at some point, and I suppose that hearing from them all is actually why we wrote the book. So we will hear first from Reverend Joe Daniels, who is the lead pastor at Emory Fellowship and developer of the Beacon Center in Washington, D.C. Emory Fellowship, under Joe's leadership, completed a remarkably long, complicated, and hugely impactful affordable housing development on their church land, which has brought transformation to their neighborhood and their congregation. Their story gives me goosebumps every time I hear it. Then we'll hear from Cote Sorens, who recently moved from the Seattle area to Chicago. She is a social innovator at the Center for Transformative Neighborhoods at Trinity Christian College. Cote is a community organizer with particular experience in how underrepresented communities make use of underutilized church buildings and land, or could if they were given the chance. Finally, we will hear from a Madison neighbor, Kurt Paulson. Kurt is a professor of urban planning here at UW-Madison and an expert in housing policy, affordable housing, zoning, and related topics. So I invite you to just sit in and listen to these great insights that these practitioners, researchers, and authors have to offer. Thanks.
Well, it's good to be with everyone tonight. I hope everyone can hear me and see me. It is an honor and privilege to be in your midst. My name is Joe Daniels, as Mark has said, and congratulations to you, Mark. We are really excited about this night and about this day. My chapter happens to be on legacy. Legacy is, in fact, a Middle English word that means person delegated. And I find that I have been amongst one of 400 people at the Emory United Methodist Church, affectionately called the Emory Fellowship, who has in fact been a person delegated. Just a brief introduction of my story. I pastor a congregation that almost closed on 2 occasions and was almost sold on 3 occasions. And the only thing keeping us open was the rental of our fellowship hall from a private school across the street. We were a church where the grass hadn't been cut for 6 years, where we were surrounded by broken alcohol bottles and beer cans mashed into the ground. On Sunday mornings, it was very, very frequent that we would smell urine on the steps, find used syringes and used condoms in the stairwells of our church. We were a dump, and the threat of closure was very, very real. But our story is one of resurrection, as Mark had indicated earlier. And we went from 55 people in worship to over 400 people in a matter of 15 to 20 years. I've been at Emory now for a little over 31 years, an anomaly in the United Methodist Church. But in that time and in that period of resurrection, we kept hearing a mission from the community that I needed an affordable place to live. I needed an affordable place to live. as a congregation of 20 different nationalities, predominantly Black, but working class people, we also had to make some serious decisions because we found ourselves in the midst of gentrification. Downtown development was pressing us on one side, and then downtown development in Washington, D.C., the city we're in, was pressing us. And then downtown development from Silver Spring, Maryland, which was an emerging downtown area in Maryland, just 2 miles north of us, was pressing us from that point. So we found ourselves as a piece of meat in between two pieces of bread, and we had to do something. We had to decide, are we going to move? Are we going to leave the city and go to the greener pastures in the suburbs? Or are we going to settle here in the midst of this neighborhood in Northwest Washington, D.C., where we had all types of urban blight around us? Are we going to make this thing work? And are we going to survive as a church? We began a listening campaign in community and began listening to what our neighbors needed and wanted and what that vision might be in context with vision that God was speaking through congregants and which God was speaking through the city. And everything began to line up toward affordable housing. We had already started housing people who were homeless in our church. We had established a transitional housing ministry, and people wanted to expand it. And we began looking at property up and down Georgia Avenue, where our church is located. And every time we would get close to settlement, the deal would fall through until one of our members said, why don't we just build right here? And none of us had ever thought about repurposing our property right where we were. We didn't even know that we could. But after doing some surveys and after doing some investigative reporting, we quickly found out that we had a humongous space because we could build up. And so we began the process of development. We began to carry out legacy. And as I indicated, my chapter is legacy can lead to life. And we found that took place and is taking place in our midst. That word legacy, again, means persons delegated, but it also means persons delegated on a mission to do something. And soon as we pursued this, we began discovering that our mission was, in fact, to provide affordable housing for people who were in the margins of society, who were marginalized and disenfranchised, who were poor, who were homeless, who were the working poor, who were gradually yet consistently being displaced from the District of Columbia, which is now one of the most expensive cities to live in. And so we began the process. We began pursuing what it would take to build new housing. We had to go through historic preservation because our church sits on a very historic site. We sit next to Fort Stevens, which is the only fort that a sitting president visited during wartime, Abraham Lincoln. Fort Stevens at that time during Civil War was the only fort that defended the White House on the northern side of the city where our church is located. And if the Confederate Army, history tells us, got past Fort Stevens, history would have been rewritten. As history is told, the Union Army was able to fight off the Confederate Army, and we were able to maintain the democracy that we have today. In the midst of all of that, we thought we had dealt with historic issues and historic preservation and wanting to build our site, but we were landmarked as we were about to begin construction on the project. As we went through the project and fought the landmark, we began to learn that our mission of seeking to house people who were marginalized and disenfranchised was in fact a mission that history had covered up, but that as we were fighting the historic preservation landmark to try to stop our project, we uncovered. Our church is on property that is very, very grounded, very much grounded in American history, in slavery, in racism, and the like. Our property sits on what was known as Vinegar Hill, which was a part of the Fort Stevens community, but was also considered an enclave for free blacks and runaway slaves. White folks begin the history of our church and of our property in 1833 when our church started in a red brick house. But as we went further in the history, trying to get beyond the historical landmark placed upon us, we discovered that our land had been owned from 1800 by a free black woman by the name of Elizabeth Proctor Thomas, who is affectionately known as Aunt Betty. And we found out that what Aunt Betty was doing all the way back to 1800, prior to the Civil War, which is where our property finds its history, he was actually housing free blacks and runaway slaves. She was essentially providing affordable housing to free blacks, to runaway slaves, to people who were in the margins of society, being displaced because they had no other place to live. And so we stuck to our mission in the midst of all that. We had people who were threatening us, saying, you need to just close. We had other people saying, you need to build market rate housing. But we found ourselves as people grounded in a legacy, persons delegated to carry out a mission that we would end up discovering had started some 250 plus years prior to us, but a mission that we ended up finding ourselves tapping into that enabled us to get over the landmark, to get over the challenges, to stop our project, and to open a 99 unit, fully affordable, $60 million affordable housing project for people being displaced from the city called the Beacon Center. Today, we are able to house people at 60% of the average median income, which is fully affordable housing in a city where the average two-bedroom apartment is $3,400 a month. We've been able to construct luxury apartments where the highest rent for a three-bedroom apartment is just $1,500 a month, and where people who are living $70,000 or less a year, families up to four, are able to live affordably and are not being displaced. Suddenly around us, around our church building, are anywhere from 260 to 300 people who are now laughing and smiling, kids running up and down the street laughing and smiling, because our church had the audacity to live out legacy, to believe that our church could be repurposed and that we could, in fact, make a difference in our neighborhood and in our city and carve a different pathway for a church that was about to close, but now one that is looked upon as a leader in the city around affordable housing, church repurposing, and the revitalization of people's lives. I'm so honored and humbled to be able to write this chapter, Legacy Can Lead to Life. I'm so humbled and honored to be a part of this great project that Mark Elsdon is doing. So great to be with everyone this evening.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Cote Sorens, and I had a chance to listen to this story before that John Daniels just shared, but it is so inspiring, and I think it tells us it's also a really great example of a congregation or of a church that was aware of the responsibility with the land they own and they had at their also for their community. My chapter on this book is titled "Who Wants a Building Anyway?" And that chapter came from myself having a glimpse into the future a little bit. I used to live in Seattle in a red-lined neighborhood called South Park, and where I got to experience something quite unique, I would say. which was a neighborhood without the availability of affordable space to encourage community. And when we have too much of something, we assume that it's always there, which is what my experience was of listening to people who are in charge of church buildings and are denominational executives. It seems that there's something about having had land available to you for a long time that makes you appreciate the power and the responsibility that you have with the church building. In the neighborhood where I was in South Park, the community was very lively. It was a neighborhood of immigrants and of low-income, younger people, and it was very civically engaged. But it was clear that for all this engagement and energy to build things, the built environment, the buildings around in the neighborhood didn't quite reflect who we were as other people, and didn't really provide much spaces for residents to do what they needed to do, which was host meetings or make art events, or just gather with others to just connect. And through this experience, it became apparent that something that often gets missed among denominational executives is that churches and their church buildings are already part of a community. No matter how congregations see themselves, no matter what beliefs they have with regards to how they engage the neighborhood around them, they are part of that community by way of their property. So the way congregations use their building, that says more about who they are as neighbors, as Christians, than anything else they could say verbally. So that was clear to me in my neighborhood. We had 3 church buildings that were completely inaccessible to community. One of them was sold rather without much thought, which created a huge loss for that community in space to gather just youth programming. And the other 2 didn't seem to understand the value of that communal space in that neighborhood. So they were also shut down and eventually sold, also inaccessible for the community. Because of this, being a Christian in the neighborhood, I engaged in a number of place-making opportunities or projects. Because we didn't have access to this kind of space, I started projects that using whatever we had. So I started a coffee shop in the neighborhood that created space for community called Resistencia Coffee. And we were able to do a number of different things with real estate in that neighborhood, that open real estate for neighborhood flourishing. But the 2 main takeaways, I guess, for this conversation would be those that congregations and their buildings are part of the neighborhood, and also are part of the narratives of land use in that city. When you are in a red line neighborhood, you can easily see how land has been used to sometimes further marginalize and further exploit certain communities in that city. Denominations have a wide scope sometimes to plan where they're going to invest for facilities, and that also gets reflected back in the map of a city, where you can see the concentration of public space and amenities by income and race that is mirrored too by congregation. So as congregations are having to deal with what to do with their buildings, I thought a good idea to propose two pointers as far as ways to think about this conversation. One is I found that the mission of the church and who we understand ourselves to be in that community matters a lot with how we go about our buildings. And to understand ourselves as a neighbor, as a loving neighbor to a community, actually can instill a different kind of imagination for what you do with your building. In the chapter, I'm referring to this way of thinking as a place-based ecclesiology. Basically, how do you understand your mission as a church, not in the abstract or your own spiritual life, but as the body of Christ? Who are we as a congregation in that community? So when we take place as an organizing principle for mission, we can easily and very concretely see the effects of who we are and how we worship and how we engage in the life of the community around us. So within a place-based mindset, we begin to ask the question of how are we to love our neighbors very literally? That grounds the conversation and it sparks the imagination and allows a congregation to really engage and look outside of ourselves and look at the people in our neighborhood who also have imagination and plans and priorities that can actually be really listened to and integrated into an imagination of what to do with these buildings. How are we to reframe or reshape this space to serve the priorities and needs and visions and dreams of this community, and more importantly, the dreams that God may have for this neighborhood, as far as access to food, access to health, access to housing, access to friendship, access to nourishing relationship. So that is one piece of it. And the second framework that I found really useful for to respark a different kind of imagination is to really understand the restorative role that land can have in a city and in a community. Land has been used for wealth creation in this country, and it has not been usually accessible to people of marginalized groups or other races. We don't have a neutral history of land ownership in this country. And as the body of Christ, we really need to wrestle with both how we have benefited from that history in the amount of land that we have, but also how is this an opportunity to redeem the narrative of land ownership? And that is, of course, a big question, and for congregations too. To know what frameworks are out there that could be helpful to this conversation. Might be useful to put a few examples. One of the frameworks that I present in my chapter is equitable development as a way of thinking beyond, includes access to housing, but also it basically thinks about the flourishing of a place in its economics, access to housing, access to healthy food, access to play, access to spending time with your neighbors and developing relationships that will sustain you. How are these neighborhoods and in their built environment sustaining the life of a community in equitable ways? So I use these two concepts, place-based ecclesiology and equitable development, to invite both congregations and denominations to think strategically around how they can utilize the real estate for the restoration of people and land and neighborhood. So I put some examples there. My story is the story of what a group of Christians did without access to buildings. But with that kind of imagination, we were able to do placemaking projects such as Resistance Coffee, which was a project by South Park for South Park. It became a space that created a platform for community, for food businesses, for artists. And eventually that community creation resulted in us doing some listening and organizing for community-based groups to be able to buy a quarter of a block in Seattle, which has a really, really aggressive real estate market. So that purchase of that land was helped stabilize the commercial real estate and also buy the community time to think how they wanted to shape the future of the neighborhood. And in addition to that, my neighborhood, as many across the United States, was decimated by highways back in the 60s and 50s.